Okay, so I'm going to share with you a couple of these examples that I found in the Bible about God appearing to women in their everyday, and just in their everyday times. And the first one is Samson's mom. Okay, this is one of the unnamed women of the Bible. Like, I tried to find out what her name was. Nobody knows. She's just Samson's mom. So in Judges 13, verse 3, it says, "The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, 'You are barren and childless, but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son.'" You know, he gives her some very specific instructions after that about how to raise this son. And she goes to tell her husband. She says, "Oh my goodness, this angel came to me, and this is what he told me." And she relays the whole experience to her husband. And her husband's response was, in verse 8 through 9, it says, "Then Manoah," who's her husband, "prayed to the Lord, 'Pardon your servant, Lord. I beg you to let the man of God you sent to us come again to teach us how to bring up the boy who is to be born.'" Okay, God had actually already given his wife some very specific instructions of how to raise the child. I think her husband was just confused, like, wait a minute, God shared it with you and not with me? Like, why would he do that, you know? And so he went to God to ask for more clarity, I guess. But this is what happens. It's so interesting. In verse 9, it says, "God heard Manoah, and the angel of God came again to the woman." Oh, hold on a second. They won't go. Sorry, it won't go to my next slide. Okay, so it says, the God heard Manoah, and the angel of God came again to the woman while she was out in the field. So he's praying, and God's choice was not to give him an answer right then and there, but to approach the woman again while she's out in the field, just doing her everyday duties. And so I've thought about this. You know, this woman was childless, she was barren. And, you know, the truth is that back then, it maybe was a little more painful for women to be barren than even for the husband, even though the husband, of course, would want a child. But in some ways, you know, we saw it in the scriptures. I mean, sometimes they could just go out and go with a maidservant and have a child through them and be able to continue their lineage, whether it was right or wrong. They did it sometimes. But for a woman, they were kind of stuck. And I just look at God and I say, you know, he saw this heartbroken woman, and he chose to come to her and to give her hope. He chose to tell her what he was going to do. He saw her pain, and he met her in her pain, and he gave her what she needed to have faith. And I love that about God, that he came to her in the field, spoke to her again. I mean, eventually the angel did come, you know, to the husband and fill him in. So he had all, you know, the information he needed to feel secure. But ultimately God used his wife. And throughout the Old Testament, there's other examples of this. You see Sarah and Hannah and Rebecca, and even the Shunammite woman, just to name a few, who, you know, you really see God come to them. But some of the most powerful examples of God coming to women's lives in their ordinary lives is when you actually look further down in time, in the time of Jesus. You know, from the time of the Old Testament to the time when Jesus came to walk the earth, you know, women had kind of become a sort of victim to a lot of man-made religious practices, honestly. And, you know, by the time he was there, in the eyes of the religious leaders, the only thing worse you could be than a woman was to be a Gentile. I mean, it wasn't like women had this, you know, they didn't always have the best end of the deal there. And so when Jesus came on the scene and he started interacting with women, his treatment, his interactions with women, his inclusion of women, they were just extraordinary. And, you know, we see it a lot through Western eyes, and we think, you know, Jesus is pretty awesome. But, you know, it must have been shocking to them back then to look at Jesus and the way he treated women. And it must have just made them feel so valued and so worthy. Well, let's look at a couple of the interactions that Jesus had with women when he came to them in their everyday life. Most of these you actually probably know, so I'm not going to read the whole story, But I think it's important to look at these one by one so that we see that it's more powerful. It's like you see how Jesus treated people and how he treated women, and it shows our value in the eyes of God. The first one is in John chapter 4, the woman at the well. We know this story. Jesus approaches her, and in verse 4, it says, "Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees were gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, and though in fact it was not Jesus who baptized but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, 'Will you give me a drink?' His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, 'You are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?' For Jews do not associate with the Samaritans." Jesus asked her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to come here to draw water." He told her, "Go call your husband and come back." And she replied, "I have no husband." And he said, "You are right when you say you have no husband. In fact, you have had 5. She was shocked that Jesus was talking to her. And if you read later on down in verse 27, even the disciples were uncomfortable, like, Jesus is talking to a woman here. But this is what's important. He knew her. He knew her struggles. He knew her pain. He knew her excuses. In verse 17, he says, "You are right when you say you have no husband." He knew her. And I love that about Jesus. She wasn't just a woman to him. She was important to him. She was worth him talking and helping her through her moment in life. And he knew her. If you look over in Luke chapter 10 and verse 38, we see the next example. I'm not going to read this whole story either because, again, you know it, where Jesus comes to the home of Mary and Martha. So he meets this woman at the well doing her everyday work of drawing water. He goes into Martha's home, and becomes a part of her family. It says in verse 38 of Luke 10, "As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened up her home." And of course, he comes in, he sits down, Martha's all worried, and he tries to tell her, like, "Come on, Martha, you're worrying about many things," But he came into her home. He sat with them. He gave them time. He didn't just expect Mary and Martha to follow him and be his disciple. He became family to them. And they knew that he loved them. And I think that's an incredible example of Jesus. And then if you look over in John chapter 11, verses 17 through 37, this is at the tomb of Lazarus. And I'm not going to, again, read the whole story, but towards the end, when he arrives, in verse 32, it says, "When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.' When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. 'Where have you laid him?' he asked. 'Come and see, Lord,' they replied. And Jesus wept." First of all, it's important to see that he traveled to them. He could have healed and risen Lazarus from afar. His disciples actually thought it wasn't safe for him to go to where Mary and Martha were. And they were like, "Okay, let's go with him. We also will die." They were all dramatic about it. And Jesus, was like, "No, we're going to go to their home. We're going to go see them." He wept with them. He was deeply moved. He didn't just, he knew what was going to happen, but you just see Jesus' heart for them. He was able to empathize with what they were feeling, and he valued their emotions so deeply that to the point that he even felt their pain. And again, just an incredible example of Jesus. And again, in Luke chapter 7, in verse 11, we'll read this whole story, the beginning of this story here. In verse 11, it says, "Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, 'Don't cry.' And then, of course, he goes and he raises her son. He had compassion on her. He did not want her to live alone. And even to the point that he didn't just, again, raise her son from the dead. He actually comforted her and just said, 'Don't cry.' Like, wouldn't that be amazing to have Jesus just come to you and put his arm around you in a moment of intense grieving and just say, 'Don't cry, I'm right here.' But that's Jesus. That's who we follow. That's who we love. That is that Jesus. And then in Mark chapter 5, one of the greatest examples of Jesus' love in all of the scriptures is the story of the bleeding woman. In Mark chapter 5, I'll start reading in verse 30. It says, "At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, 'Who touched my clothes?' 'You see the people crowding against you,' his disciples answered, 'and yet you asked, 'Who touched me?' But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering.'" The most touching part to me about that passage is verse 32, where it says that he kept looking around for her to see who had done it. He wanted to make sure that she felt valued. She was already healed. He wasn't trying to find her so he could now heal her. She was actually already healed her. He wanted her to know that she was loved. He wanted her to know that she could go now and be free from her suffering. And he was not about to let her just disappear into the crowd. These things about Jesus, they're so touching to me. They make me feel so loved by him. And this one, I can barely read this story without crying, so bear with me if I do. But John chapter 20, this is the last story we'll read about of Jesus. At the tomb in John chapter 20, it says, "Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white, seating where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and one at the foot. They asked her, 'Woman, why are you crying?' 'They have taken my Lord away,' she said, 'and I don't know where they have put him.' At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. And she didn't realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, 'Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?' Thinking he was the gardener, she said, 'If you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him.' And Jesus said to her, 'Mary.'" Now, why that makes me cry is because I think here Jesus knew her by name. He could have said, sister. He could have said daughter. He could have said woman. A lot of times in the scriptures, they were just called woman. But he valued her as an individual and as a woman, and he knew her by name. And so instead of using those terms, he actually just said Mary. Before I was a Christian, my biggest insecurity was to not be good enough. My worldly solution to that was to try to be nicer to people, to try to always look pretty, to try to just be somebody that people would like, Of course, that doesn't really lead you down very many good paths. I got involved in a lot of sin because I was trying to be liked by people. I'm sure you can relate to that before you were disciples, or sometimes we struggle with it even now. You know, as a disciple, probably my, probably my biggest problem as a disciple, sorry, can you guys still hear me? Okay, good. Sorry. So I thought something was telling me they couldn't hear me. My biggest trouble as a disciple has been not feeling good enough. You know, maybe I'm not talented enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not bold enough. You know, all of these things. And God has used blessings and he's used challenges to force me into dealing with those insecurities. Again, I'm sure you can relate. You know, but as I thought about my own experiences, I was trying to think of just how does this aspect of Jesus relate to my life? Like, how have I felt him personally know my name? You know, Marshall and I have shared with you guys over the years different stories of like answered prayers and things that God has done in our life. So it's not just one. I think we all have probably felt different times in our life where we really know that God knows us. But I think there's one that comes to mind more recently that I definitely felt like God was showing me that I was worth his time, that I was worthy in his eyes. And it was last year, my son Kyle, who's now 15, was, he was having some problems with his eyes, and we took him into the eye doctor, and they found that his optic nerve had pressure against it. And so the ophthalmologist did a bunch of tests, and at the end of the test was very concerned and, basically feeling like maybe he had a brain tumor. And so I took him, he said, I really want you to get an MRI done. And so I left that office, of course, feeling like, heartbroken and just terrified that maybe he was, going to have something horribly wrong with him. I came home, and I think that was like on a Thursday evening. So Friday morning when I woke up, I was just beside myself. Marshall was out of town. I think there was something else going on. I think something was going on with my mom's health. I can't even remember. I know that there was multiple things going on. And I just got on my knees and I told God, you have got to lift up my arms. I can't, this is too heavy. I can't do this. Like, I just did not have the emotional ability to think through my 15-year-old maybe having a brain tumor. And so I went to Wendy's house that day for our discipling time, walked in her door and just started crying, of course, because, I couldn't help myself. And as we're sitting there, I got a phone call from the imaging center. But the person on the other line said, Shawn, I know you. I'm a sister in your church. And she said, I had this vision the other day that I was going to see Marshall Mead in my work office. She works at an imaging center. And I was like, okay, just to give you background, I love this sister, but I don't know her very well. So it wasn't like that was abnormal, for her to have a thought that she was going to see Marshall in her office. It's like we are more acquaintances from church, but not like spend any time together up to that point. So, and she said, when I saw Kyle's name come across my desk as needing this MRI, and the MRI, of course, says a brain, it says what they need. She said, I told my boss, we need to get this kid in immediately. This is my pastor's son. And we were able to get an appointment on a Saturday, which I think probably doesn't hardly ever happen. We got it the very next day. And then she said, and on top of that, my boss said that we'll give this to you guys for free. We'll take care of the cost. And what I felt like in that moment was that God valued me. Like, he heard me. I mean, he was like, I'm going to lift up your arms. At that point, I didn't know how it would all turn out, but there was just something in me that felt like God knows me. He knows my name, and he's working. He used this very strange situation of a sister feeling like she was being told that Marshall was going to join her in her office. And then, God has said, now it ended up Kyle's MRI was clean and it's fine. He just has some weird thing with his optic nerve, I guess. But there was no major concern out of all of that. But I think that even without having a diagnosis at that point, I felt like God knew me. I think we all have a desire and a need to feel known by God. And it comes through, different emotions and different experiences for all of us. But our need is all the same. And ladies, I want us to remember that he knows each of us by name, not just as a follower, not even just as a friend, not even just as a sister or even a daughter. He knows each of us by name. In the fellowship in heaven, Jesus isn't going to be like, hey, sister, can't quite remember who you are, but I know you're awesome, kind of how we can do in fellowship. Sometimes you can't remember someone's name. You're like, sister, hi. It's not going to be that way in heaven. He's going to be able to call us individually by name, just like he did with Mary. One of the sentences in that statement, the little story I read at the beginning, at the very end of it, she says, he sees us. And if we open our eyes and our hearts, we will see him, even in the most ordinary places and in the most ordinary things. I think most of the time we don't see God in our ordinary times and places just because our eyes aren't open. We have to remember that we are valuable to God. My PowerPoint is stuck at the moment, so I don't know that I'll be able to share with you this last part, but I'm going to read it anyway. There's a quote that says, deeper than knowing God is being known by God. What defines us as Christians is not most profoundly that we have come to know him, but that he took note of us and made us his own. 1 Corinthians 8:3 says, but whoever loves God is known by God. And the amplified version of that says, but if anyone truly loves God truly, with affection, reverence, prompt obedience, and grateful recognition of his blessing, then he is known by God, recognized as worthy in his intimacy and love, and is owned by him. And I like the amplified version because it said recognized as worthy of his intimacy and love. Sisters, let's really strive to remember these things in all that we do. Let us continue to be a bright light, a shining light to the women around us, have hope for ourselves, and remember how much Jesus loves us, and give hope to people around us. Let people know that there is an answer, there is truth, and that Jesus, he wants to know each of us by name. So that is what I have to share with you today. I'm sorry that you couldn't see the whole presentation at the end. It kind of glitched for some odd reason. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to break into some breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. And so you'll be put into the breakout rooms randomly, and then those breakout